I'm just gonna shortly say a little bit about me. So yes, I'm an agile coach, and a lot of what I do is working with people. I tend to work on stuff like psychological safety or communication, collaboration, and retrospectives. So it's very often on the softer side of agile coaching. I'm also a speaker, and I like to do co-speaking and co-workshops as well. And I have my own company called Native Wired. This is my Twitter ID, but be aware that I do tweet a lot. And of course, I am a certified unicorn, and I am also a certified unicorn certifier. Um, so, the thing that I'm going to talk to you about today is mainly stress and how that also can become depression. So, the thing about stress is can you please make full screen for now? Yeah, good. Thank you. Um, okay, so how does stress show? So the way that stress shows is by very different things. So I'm going to use the very traditional agile thing. It depends. So the thing about stress is that it shows really different in different people. With some people, it's obvious to see what's going on, and with other people, it is not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you my story first, and then I'm going to relate it to how you can deal with stress in general. So when I was suffering from stress, what really happened to me was that my brain felt like the pieces didn't fit together, like there was something missing. I remember the first time I was in between jobs, and a lot of stuff had happened the year before. My mom died, my dad had his leg amputated. I did not have a good relationship with my mom, so it felt as a relief that she died, but it didn't to my sister. So we kind of almost lost each other there. I had a lot of work at my then company, and then they fired me. So I had a breakdown. And one of the things that made me realize that this was really bad was that I was meeting a friend for coffee. And there was a third guy, and I was like, yeah, he seems familiar. Maybe I went to university with him or something. And then during the conversation, I realized that I worked with the guy for 2 years. So I had a lot of these small things. And at some point, actually, I had to bring a notepad with me everywhere because my short-term memory was not functioning properly. And it would be totally gone. Like normally when I forget stuff, it would be like, oh yeah, I should have done that. But this would be like totally gone from my brain. And my emotional state was very, very dark. So a lot of what happened was that, people give you feedback. And I don't know if you can see here in the first picture, but it says all this good stuff, and then it goes, you can be a jerk sometimes. And that is kind of what stuck with me. And that's kind of what I remembered all the time. I kind of like every time I got any kind of small feedback, that would just stay with me if it was bad feedback. And all the good stuff would just disappear. Or sometimes it wouldn't even kind of enter. I wouldn't notice that it was there. And I was getting in a state that became more and more dark. So if I look at how it felt for me when before I went on sick leave, I was on a really stressful project in IBM. When anything happened, I had to report to 7 level of managers. And I was working as a scrum master, so I was doing whatever I could to protect the team. I would also be working in the evenings if anything had to be done because I was the only one without kids. So it wasn't as much an effort for me. But looking back, I think the hardest part was that about, not knowing what was going on, trying to protect people, having kind of so many levels of managers watching out that you are doing things right. And I recall sitting one evening in October or November and thinking, if this continues, I will literally die. Of course, I was thinking it in Danish since I was mostly working in Danish at that point. But I really had this kind of like, okay, if this continues, I will die. Um, and the interesting part was this didn't stop me at all. because things had to be done. And this, now that I look back at it, I think this is terrible, but I also see that this happens to a lot of people. So if I look at a timeline, what happened was that in October, November of 2009, no, 2008 it must have been, I had this feeling, if this continues, I will die. And yet I did what had to be done. I was working on my project. We had to hand it over to a different supplier, and we managed to do it on time, and we delivered what we were supposed to, and everything was good. And then I joined a new project because you can't just walk around and do nothing. So I went on a new project, which luckily for me was cancelled. It was one of these interesting things where the client kept telling us what we would do, and then we did a rough estimate. And it turned out that the amount of money they had was like 100 of what would pay for what they actually wanted us to deliver. So the good thing for me was that, well, I could go on vacation. I knew I didn't have a project, but that wasn't a big problem. So during my vacation, I just became more and more tired. And since I didn't have a project, I called my manager and I said, can I just have another week of vacation since I'm not on a project? And she said, yes, but only on one condition. I want you to go talk to your doctor about stress. And I was like, yeah, I'll do that. And I did not expect anything to come out of it. So what happened when I went to the doctor is that he said, not only are you stressed, you have a severe depression. I would like you to go on sick leave. And in the beginning, I was like, yeah, I'll be on sick leave for 2 weeks and then I'll be fine. What really happened was that once I was on sick leave, I kind of started letting go of everything. And at that point, I was still doing it. People knew I was stressed, but I was taking care of everything. And that's one of the things that I have seen is that some people go like, yeah, you can always tell when people are stressed because they start slacking off, they start not getting things done. But it wasn't this way. For me, it was like, I got everything done. And I still think that if I have something I need to get done, I will keep working on this until I drop. It's like being well, someday we won't be able to talk about this, but like being a gas car and you run on the fumes, and you know that you will continue doing this kind of like until if you're lucky, the car gets to a gas station, but it might just break down. And that's kind of where I was. And I actually didn't get back to work full time until March of 2010. So I was home for 9 months. And one of the reasons I started talking about this was that, so one of the things I did during this time was to kind of stay connected to the workplace, which is always a good idea. It's like I would go to lunches and I went to the Christmas party. And one of the things that happens at Christmas parties is that people get a little bit drunk, which means that they lower their defenses. And one of my colleagues told me that, yeah, he had this thing where all of a sudden he started crying at work, but then he just went home for the rest of the day and the next day he was fine. And I found this to be really, really, really scary that we have people who just cry at work and go to work the next day. And this was not an emotional guy. He would not be anyone who would be sharing emotions or naturally crying. This was one of these tough guys. And that's actually part of why I started talking about this. So when I started back at work, I started with 3 hours a week. And when my doctor said this, I was like, yeah, sure, I can do 3 hours a week. But actually, that was really, really tough. And just going to work required a few days of rest. So during this time, I talked to my doctor almost every 2 weeks. I did have a stress consultant, but my problem with him was that he had one set of tools and that didn't work with me. And then he didn't have anything else. So he just wanted me to do that more. But my own doctor helped me a lot. And I ended up actually going on antidepressives. But this was the second time I went on antidepressives. The first time I got off them as fast as possible. which was a big mistake, I see now. But for me, the first time it made me feel weak. And now I know that it's part of what my brain needs to actually live. So you go, yeah, this is your story, but why should we care? And the reason I'm doing this talk, and I've done this talk a lot of times, is that I see this so much. I see people suffering from stress, from depression, from anxiety, and it's only grown worse after we've been working at home and we have so much unknown around us. And I kept hearing all these stories, and I figured out that if I start talking about this, maybe one person will hear this and they will get help. So I did this in 2018 at Craft in Budapest. And one thing I do when I do this live in front of an audience is I ask people to stand up and not sit down until I'm done. And I say, if you know someone who has stress, anxiety, depression, or any kind of other mental problems, please sit down. And out of 800 people, 20 people were standing. So 20 people did not know someone who had stress, depression, anxiety, or anything similar. And even though I logically know the numbers before I did the talk, that was just scary. And that's one of the reasons I keep talking about this. And I keep talking about why we need to take care of our mental health. And there's a lot of scary stuff with this. There's a Japanese term called karoshi, which basically means death by work. And sometimes it will be literally working yourself to death, so working until you drop. But the other part of that is suicide. Sadly, that's also something we see in our industry here and there. We don't tend to talk about it. There's been a bunch of that with very young people in the DevOps in the US. But we don't like to talk about these things, so it's not something that's kind of been up in the open. And when I started looking into this, one of the things I found out was that if you look at men, for instance, the main cause of death for men from 15 to 45 is suicide. And the numbers I found is from Denmark, Sweden, UK, Germany. In Scotland, I saw some papers last year that said that 75% of men under 45 who die is suicide. So in Denmark, there was a big, I was going to say survey or experiment. They looked, I don't know what it's called in English. I'm just going to skip that. They looked into what's going on with these things. Why are there so many men committing suicide? What is the mental health of men in general? And when they started looking into this, they found that a lot of men still suffer under having to be strong, which then means that you don't want to show you're weak. And sometimes that even leads to suicide. But also, like in lesser things, that men tend to not go to the doctor. So like the mortality of men, for instance, with cancer is usually higher because they go at a later point. And one of the things that stuck with me in this report was this guy saying, if I'm not feeling well, I eat in the locker room because I don't want to lie when people ask me how I'm doing. So rather than tell his colleagues that he was not doing well, he would eat alone. And I think that having that and being in a very much male culture, I think this is a big problem. We need to be able to talk about these things. And suicide is terrible, but even just being stressed or depressed and not being able to speak about this thing is equally hard. And of course, these numbers are for men. I saw some numbers last year from UK that says their suicide is rising for women as well. And suicide is kind of the most terrible thing, but there's still terrible thing even if you don't get to that point. And an interesting part that I learned a few years ago, interesting, sad, is that our brain shrinks. So our brain physically shrinks if we don't do nothing. If we don't have some times where we spend nothing, our I need to take a note. Right temporoparietal junction, which is here, literally shrinks. So they did a lot of tests on this, and you can physically see that it shrinks on the scannings that they make. And the thing is, we need this to collect information and processes, and we need this to be innovative. And if there's one thing we need in our industry and in our world, it is to be innovative. So basically, because we don't do nothing, because we do something all the time, our brain literally shrinks. And then it's kind of like, why does this happen more and more? Sometimes I'm not sure if it happens more and more, and sometimes I am. It's really hard to say. We hear about it more and more, but I also think it's happening more and more. And these are just guesses. I am not an expert in stress, depression, and mental things. I suffer from it myself, and I live with it myself on the good times, and I look into it. So my guess is one is that we have a performance culture. So if you look around, we always have to be good. If you look at Facebook, a lot of the posts on Facebook or Instagram, I don't even know what the young people use nowadays, are perfect. Oh, I just cooked this perfect meal, or I went jogging before I bake bread for my kids in the morning. And it's like showing this that we can do. When we meet people, the first thing that we ask them is, so what do you do? Whereas a more interesting question is kind of like, so what makes you happy? What is interesting for you? But we are so focused on performance culture, on getting that next job, on being good enough the whole time. And that's stressful for us. And the other part is that we have way too many options. Or maybe not too many, but we have a lot of options. I usually say, like, when I was a kid and you went to the shop and you would get like a hairspray, you could get cheap hairspray and expensive hairspray. That was it. Now you go there and there are like 20 different hairsprays, not to mention all the other products. And it's like that with everything. And that's also one of the things that's stressing us right now, that we are so much at home, is that the world is on our screens. We can literally do anything we want to do. We can attend conferences all over the world. But the problem is, it's not always good for us. And at the same time, we have fear of missing out. We're so afraid to miss out on something good. We want to take part in things. We want to enjoy things. So even though we can practice saying no, it's so much easier to say no to boring stuff. But what about all the good stuff? And then a friend of mine, Fritz, who's a photographer, said, maybe it's because in the Western world, we value doing more than being. So when we talk about things, we often talk about doing something. Like I said, with Facebook, baking or running. When we talk about work, it's like, yeah, I did this talk or I had that project. We very rarely value being. And I think we need to go more back to being to actually take care of ourselves. And if we look at it, knowledge workers are very affected. And maybe that's why we're seeing it more, because more of the work we do is knowledge work. And the thing with most knowledge work is there's always more to do than we can manage. You can have endless to-do lists, endless backlogs. There's always more than we can manage. We will never ever be done. Whereas if you are making 10 chairs as a carpenter, you're done when the 10 chairs are done. For us, there's always more to do. Not saying that carpenters can't get stressed, because they definitely can. And most people in the knowledge industry, in the IT industry, we are here because we like what we do. Most of us have some kind of education. Some have maybe 5 years education if you took a PhD, even longer, which means that we chose this. We actually like what we do. And very often when we talk about stress, we talk about it as something that comes from the outside, something that pushes us. But I think a lot of our stress comes from the inside because we truly love what we do. I just read an article about this artist, and he said he slept 4 hours per night because he was so passionate about creating his art. And that passion can also be dangerous because that means that we don't take the time to actually go in and rest. And then a lot of us suffer from imposter syndrome. And if you don't know what the imposter syndrome is, it's basically that you think you are a fake despite having evidence of the opposite. And this is something that up to 70% of the Western population suffer from at some point in their life. Having the feeling that whatever they're presenting, it is fake. And our work is not tangible. So during some summers, I helped out my ex-father-in-law in a grocery shop. And some of the really nice stuff about that was like, when we would get like this pallet of groceries that needed to go into the shelves, and you would just take one cardboard box at a time, you would lift it over, you would fill up the shelves, you would fold the cardboard and put it into recycling. And you could see where you were going. And so much of what we do is not that. If you are, when I was a tester, I was sometimes like, oh, I wish I was a programmer, because at least programmers produce something. And a lot of what I do is I look at something and figure out if there's something wrong with it. And I find that that element is now even harder now that I'm an agile coach, because a lot of what I do is I create a space for people, but I also plant seeds. And sometimes these seeds will grow into something and sometimes they won't. But I might not know it because it could be something that happens a year later. But even if you are a programmer, you don't see software, very rarely at least. And you can sit for a full day working on something and not get any results. And there's no tangible kind of result from it. And somehow we kind of need that. We need to know where we're going. We need to know that we achieved something. And there are no natural limits to our work. So again, I'll use the example with a carpenter. So when a carpenter leaves his workshop and goes home, he might think about, how will I create the next chair? But most of his work will happen in the workshop. Whereas our main tool is our head. Yes, we need our hands. Well, actually, we don't need our hands. I worked with a developer who didn't have hands, but we do need to type something into a computer or speak to a computer, whatever. But all of our work takes place here, and we have our head with us always. And I think part of this is what leads us to stress. So unless we do something to set natural limits, we will kind of always be working. So like one of my friends who's working from home right now, what she does is every morning she opens the door and she takes a walk and she comes back and then she is at work. And in the evening, she does the same. Go out, take a walk, come back, and then she's at home. To kind of set those clear limits to the work that she does. So this was a lot about why it's not good, but the good thing is we can start doing things about it. So these are some I'll just take some water. So these are some tips. And like I said, stress is very different from person to person. Depression is very different from person to person. So you kind of need to figure out what works for you. What is the thing that helps you? So these are kind of some general tips, and I'm still learning to perfect them. So one of them is to say no. And like I said earlier, I practiced this for a long time. Saying no to stuff that you don't want to do is the first step. You really don't want to meet up with someone or whatever, and you say no. And then the part comes where you need to say no to all the interesting stuff to be able to have enough time for yourself. And that's when it gets hard. And what gets even harder is that sometimes you have to say no to stuff you already agreed on. So I tried this in When was this, 2015, where I had to say no to a conference that I already agreed to speak on because I was getting stressed again. And one of the things I do is I use my friend Torbjørn as one of the things, he's not a thing. I use him to give me permission because I'm not able to say no to stuff like that. Like, for instance, saying no to a conference that I already agreed to, even though it was 2 months ahead and they had plenty of time to find a new speaker. So I talked to him about giving me permission to do this. And even though he has no ruling over me, that kind of helped me to say, okay, it's actually okay for me to say no to these things. But it is really hard. And remember to plan preparation time. I think that's something we tend to not do. Very often I hear people complaining about meetings, for instance. And yes, some meetings are horrible, but they're also a good tool for some of the things that we want to do. And very often, one of the reasons that our meetings are not good is that we don't prepare. We don't read that piece of paper that we're supposed to read before we go into the meeting, or the person running the meeting having prepared and kind of fumble around. Or like if you're speaking at a conference, one of the things that I really struggled with, especially in 14 and 15, when a lot of people wanted me to speak, was that I just looked at my calendar and saw if I had time to do this. I did not look in my calendar and say, do I actually have time to prepare my talk? Or even worse, sometimes I had to write a new talk. Do I have time to write that new talk? So plan that in. And even in your daily life, just plan a bit of preparation time. Block out some hours per day where you can just prepare things. And try to relax your brain. And this is very different for different people. So one of the things that some people find very helpful is meditation. I find meditation very helpful, but I'm not very good at doing it. So actually getting around to doing it. And meditation is not about just sitting and thinking about nothing, but it's about sitting and letting your thoughts be. And sometimes you can get guided meditation. Some people just like to sit and think, but that can be something to relax your brain. And you can, it doesn't need to be like meditation as in, okay, I sit now and I sit on a pillow and I put on some nice candles and everything. It can also be taking a walk in nature or sitting and staring at water, something that helps your brain. And one of the other things you can do is more mindfulness, actually starting to be aware of things that are around you. Maybe if you are drinking your coffee, maybe close your eyes and actually taste, what does that first sip of coffee taste like? Being aware of this, try to really taste things, try to really feel things. And part of what this does is it gets us out of our head. So I talked about the stress consultant who couldn't help me before. And one of the things he said to me all the time was, you need to get in your body. And I was like, what is he talking about? I am in my body. And when I was working with my doctor, what he said, well, it's not so much about being in your body as it is getting out of your head. So he was able to explain it to me in a different way. And one of the things he said, well, you said, for instance, you like to take a bath. One of the things you can do when you take a bath is you can move your legs. And by moving your legs and actually sensing how the water feels on your legs when you move them in water, that takes the focus out of your brain and into your body. Or even just feeling it on the chair you're sitting on right now. Just feeling, how does it feel against my back, against my thighs? Or if you're standing up, how does the floor feel against my feet? So becoming more mindful of that can help you get out of your head and into your body. And then there's exercise. And this just happens to be my friend Torbjørn, who helps me a lot. And running for some people is quite meditative. And research shows that exercise is really good for us, both when we are stressed, but also when it comes to depression and anxiety. And actually, it can be really good to do this in nature as well, depending on where you are, of course. But the thing with this is you need to be careful, because if you are in a really bad state, then pushing yourself to exercise can actually is actually not helpful. It will lead you to a place where you just feel either guilty because you didn't do your exercise, or you actually do it and then you feel more stressed because it's time that went away. But as long as you are not like at the bottom, exercise is good for you, even if it's just taking a walk. And then asking for help. And asking for help, I mean, in so many ways. Like asking for help, like if you have something at work where it's too much, asking somebody else to help you out. And for me, that kind of help is not too difficult to ask for. If I need to ask with something physical, like putting up paintings on the wall or putting up lamps and stuff, I can ask for that. The hard part for me to ask for is the more what's the social help. Like, when I'm feeling bad and I just need to blabber out, or I need someone to give me a hug and say everything is going to be fine. Or even having asked someone to take me to the doctor when I was really sick. That is the hardest part. And I practice this. And one of the things that helps me with this is I've talked to some friends about this, that if you don't ask for help because you're afraid to bother someone, you take away their option to decide if they want to help you or not. So asking for help is a good thing. And be kind to yourself. Because, for instance, at the moment, we are all in a situation where the world is really insecure. If we look at the numbers of COVID in most countries, it's going up and down, and it can really change within a very short moment. We don't really know what's going on. When I came home to work in March, I was like, yeah, we're going to work from home in a few months and then everything will be fine. And right now, everything is just insecure. And which also puts you in a sense of stress. It doesn't mean that you can't enjoy working from home. I know a lot of people who enjoy working from home, who enjoy the fact that they can actually be with their family, that they don't need to commute, stuff like that. But if you are in a state of stress, and even if you're not, be kind to yourself. Your feelings are always okay. Your actions might not be, but your feelings are always okay. Oh, and I would like to thank Joanna, who had a T-shirt about being kind, because I'd forgot to put it on my slides. And take time off. And I don't just mean take time off work. I also mean take time off whatever else you are doing. So one of the product owners I worked with suffers a lot from anxiety. And for him, it can sometimes be really stressful having the kids. They have 2 small kids at breakfast. And he actually has an agreement with his wife that once the kids are dressed and start on breakfast, he can go for a walk. Because that way he has more energy to help her with the rest. And then she gets time off at other points. So figuring out what is it that you need time off from, and do that. So now I talked a lot about how can you help yourself, and I'm going to talk about what can we do to help others. But first, I'll tell you about what not to do. Don't say pull yourself together, because if we could, we would. And very often when you are in a state of stress, depression, anxiety, what happens is you blame yourself. And if somebody else says we should just pull ourselves together, we then blame ourselves for not being able to pull ourselves together, and then it just gets worse. Or many people are worse off than you. I know a lot of people say like, yeah, I'm really feeling terrible, but at least I get food every day. I know there are many people who don't eat every day. That's not the point. If you're feeling bad, you're feeling bad. And of course, there are people that are worse off than you and that you might be able to help in some way, but don't tell people that. Or you have no reason to be depressed, stressed, have anxiety. We know that. Sometimes they found that sometimes depression and stress, well, depression at least, can be activated by a single incident. But most of the time, it is small things that is leading to this, or it is a deficiency where your brain doesn't produce enough serotonin or non-adrenaline. And by telling people they have no reason to feel this way, they're kind of saying it's not okay for you to feel this way. or it's all in your head. And it's kind of like, duh, we knew that. And I think that I at least tended to blame myself a lot more for the things in my head, because if it's in my head, it's just in my head. Whereas if I broke an arm, I would get cast on it and I would take care of that. When I break my head inside, I don't take care of it the same way. And when everything comes to it, everything is actually in our head. Even the pain that we feel somewhere would come from our head. And don't ignore them. Don't just pretend that nothing is going on, because something is going on. So acknowledge that something is going on. And don't give unfunded advice, which you can say that's part of what I'm doing now. I'm not saying to you to do all these things. I'm telling you to actually go in and look at these things and see if it helps you. But if you tell people, oh, if you're stressed, you just need to do that. Especially if people are very stressed, the best thing you can do is actually help them go to see a doctor. So what should I do then? Well, offer your help, but subtle. Going out and saying, you know what, you look really stressed, how can I help you? Might not be the best idea. But going like, you want to go for coffee, and then you can chit chat about, if you need any help with the stuff you're working on, let me know. I'm always here to talk. But don't push it on it. Offer it. Make it an offer and not, you have to take this. And listen. I like to say, grow your ears and open your heart. People often in these situations need to talk. And they need someone to listen to them. So that's part of what you can do. Actually listen to them, not to answer, but just to hear what's being said. It doesn't mean you have to agree on everything, but listen to them properly. And tell them to go to a professional. So if somebody is feeling really bad, go to a professional. And sadly, there are a lot of professionals I know in a lot of countries who don't take these things serious, but there are also a lot of professionals who do. And sometimes we are not able to give that help. Even though we can help with small things, we are not able to give proper professional help on mental issues and stress. So if somebody is suffering, tell them to go to a professional, or maybe even offer to take them there. And respect what they feel, because no matter what, their feelings are valid. And include people. So even though people might be feeling down, make sure you include them. Make sure they have the option to opt in and do stuff with you, but also make sure that they have the option to opt out. And of course, to be kind, which is very essential. Be kind to people. We're all struggling in different ways, and you need to be kind. And of course, you need to care for people. And caring is very different. So like in this case, it's a hug. That's not something we can do with most people right now. But actually, generally caring for people, people can sense if you care about them. So that can also be helpful. So the donkey is called Eeyore in English, æseldyr in Danish. And I have this as an example because, so he's basically depressed. All the time he's feeling down, and yet his friends always include him. They always include him on adventures, and it helps him. Like the time when he thinks that his birthday is forgotten, and then everyone shows up, and he's this close to being happy. So I think this is a really good example of including someone on their terms. They're not requiring for him to be happy and joyful. They just include him just the way he is. So to wrap this up, talk about these things. I think that's one of the best things we can do, is start talking more about these things, because it does exist everywhere. Ask for help. Whether that is help with work or help to actually cope with these things, but do ask for help. And offer help. And I deliberately write offer instead of give help, because it needs to be an offer. It is very rare that people are at a point where you have to give them help. There can be people who are so far out that you need to kind of take them by the hand and take them to a doctor, but this is very, very, very rare. And talk to each other. So have these discussions, talk about things, talk about your life, talk about what's going on, talk about the good things. And of course, be kind and care for people. So that's what I had to say. I will send these slides to Johanna and you can get access to them afterwards. And one of the things that I always talk to people about is feel free to approach me afterwards, whether I will be in Gather Town or my email or Twitter, whatever. All my information is on here, plus some link to some amazing videos. Because sometimes it doesn't feel comfortable to speak about things in a big setting like this.